There is a question that every intelligence agency eventually asks, not in boardrooms, not in briefings, but in the quiet moment before an operation is approved. The question is not, can we get someone in? The question is, can we get someone back? And the honest answer, in the cases that matter most, is, we don't know. In 2004, a young woman sat in a safe house on the outskirts of Tel Aviv and was handed a folder. Inside the folder was someone else's life. A childhood in Isfahan she had never lived. A mother and father who had died in a car accident on a road she had never driven. A school she had never attended. A neighborhood she had never smelled. The folder was thick. It had taken 18 months to build, and the woman who received it was being asked to climb inside it and never look back. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Roya. That is not her real name. Her real name is classified. What is not classified, what has surfaced, in fragments, across Iranian government counterintelligence reports, and in the testimony of former Mossad officers speaking carefully to journalists, is what she was asked to do, and roughly what it cost her. She was in her late 20s. She had grown up in a Persian Jewish household in Israel, which meant she had heard Farsi at the dinner table her whole life. She understood the specific music of Iranian grief, Iranian pride, Iranian humor. She knew how Iranian mothers spoke to their sons. She knew how Iranian women held silence in public and filled rooms in private. She was not trained to understand these things. She simply was these things, by inheritance, by accident, by the random geography of where her grandparents had fled from. Mossad understood that this was rare. This was not a language skill you could teach in a classroom. This was something that lived in the body, and in 2004, they needed exactly that body, in exactly that city, for reasons that would only become clear to her years later, when she was already too deep inside to care about reasons. The problem that launched the operation was simple to state and almost impossible to solve. By 2005, the international intelligence community knew Iran was accelerating its nuclear program. They knew the facilities. They knew the scientists' names. They had the architecture. What they did not have was the interior, the human texture of the program. Who was driving it from conviction? Who was doing it from fear? Who was lying awake at night? Who, if approached correctly, might cooperate? Satellites cannot tell you that. Intercepted phone calls cannot tell you that. Only a person inside the social world of the people you are watching can tell you that. And the social world of Iran's nuclear engineers did not live inside the facilities. It lived in dinner parties, in extended family gatherings, in the conversations that happened after the children went to bed. It lived with the wives, the sisters, the neighbors. It lived in exactly the kind of intimate, closed, trust-based community that is almost completely impenetrable to a foreign intelligence service, unless that service can produce a human being who belongs there. That was the assignment: not to steal documents, not to sabotage equipment, not to recruit a scientist, to belong, to be present, to listen, to be the kind of person that people forget to be careful around. The word Mossad uses for a constructed identity is a legend. A legend is not a disguise. A disguise is temporary, surface level, built to survive a single encounter. A legend is a life, a complete, internally consistent, emotionally inhabited life that can survive years of casual scrutiny from people who care about you. It has to include not just facts, but feelings. Not just memories, but the specific imprecision of real memory. Real people do not remember their childhood street addresses with perfect accuracy. Real people misremember. A perfect legend is, paradoxically, a slightly imperfect one. Roya spent 18 months becoming Roya. The accent was refined to Isfahan, not Tehran, where accents are more standard and scrutiny is highest. But Isfahan, where educated families cluster and where the softness of the regional dialect carries a warmth that makes people lean in rather than step back. She memorized streets. She memorized the names of teachers at a school she had never entered. She was given a grief, dead parents, a car accident, 2001, the Karaj Road. That was specific enough to be believable and painful enough that polite people would not probe it. She was told something in the final days of her preparation that she would return to, mentally, many times in the years ahead. Her trainer said, "A cover does not protect you by being flawless. It protects you by being human. Humans are inconsistent, humans forget. A cover that never wavers feels wrong to the people around you. A cover that breathes, that occasionally stumbles in small ways, that recovers with the natural awkwardness of someone protecting a private pain. That is the cover that lasts." She was 30 years old when she landed in Isfahan. She carried one suitcase. She had a phone number memorized, a low-level Mossad asset already embedded in the city who was supposed to be her first point of contact, her first thread back. She had emergency protocols, communication windows, dead drop locations she had memorized from photographs she had studied in a room she was not allowed to discuss. She had never been to Isfahan. She had studied it so thoroughly that she had forgotten, almost, that she had never been there. That confusion between the city she had memorized and the city she was now walking through was, she would later say, the strangest experience of the entire operation. The streets were where the maps said they would be. The smells were not. Within 72 hours of her arrival, the asset whose number she had memorized was arrested by Iranian intelligence. The circumstances were unrelated to her. He had been under surveillance for weeks before she landed. But she did not know that. She knew only that the one person in the city she could have reached out to in an emergency was now inside an Iranian detention facility. She was alone, in a city she had only ever visited on paper, with a life she had built from a folder. She did not leave. The question of why she did not leave, whether it was training, discipline, belief in the mission, or something harder to name, is one she has never answered publicly. What she did instead was something that intelligence trainers prepare you for intellectually, but cannot fully simulate. She went to the market. She went for a walk. She came home and made tea. She introduced herself to her neighbor. The neighbor's name was Mariam. She was in her late 50s. She sold handmade carpets. She had an opinion about everything and a loneliness about her that she covered with generosity. She invited Roya for dinner within the first week. She spoke about her son, a civil engineer, working on infrastructure projects outside the city. Quiet, responsible, good. She said his name the way mothers say the names of sons they are trying not to advertise. Roya thanked her for the food, helped with the dishes, and walked back to her apartment. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a long time. Mariam was warm. Mariam was kind. Mariam was exactly the kind of person that a woman alone in a new city, with no family and no history, would naturally be drawn to. And Mariam was also, without knowing it, the open door to the world Roya had been sent to enter. The question that Roya did not ask herself that night, because she was trained not to ask it, because asking it was a luxury the operation could not afford, was a simple one. What happens to Mariam when this is over? The dinner invitation became a standing arrangement. Every Thursday. Mariam cooked for 3 even when it was just the 2 of them, the way women who have fed large families cannot stop feeding. Roya came every week. She helped with the dishes. She listened. She learned. This is a thing that training gets wrong about long-term deep cover. The training prepares you for dramatic moments, the identity check, the suspicious official, the unexpected question at a border. What it does not prepare you for is the accumulation of ordinary moments, the weight of consistency, the way a real relationship builds a record, week by week, that must be maintained with the same precision as any forged document. Every detail Roya shared about herself became a detail she had to remember forever. The exact phrasing of how she described her mother, the specific texture of sadness she allowed to show when the subject of her childhood came up. Enough to be human, not enough to invite sustained sympathy, which always leads to more questions. She kept a private mental ledger. Every Thursday, she updated it. After 6 weeks, Miriam mentioned her son by name, Dariush. After 8 weeks, he came home for dinner while Roya was there. He was quiet in the particular way of men who have been trained by their environments to be careful. He worked long hours. He came home tired. He noticed Roya with the sideways attention of someone who has learned not to stare. He was not on any list. He was not a target. He was a civil engineer on infrastructure projects at Natanz, not a scientist, not a decision maker, not someone who sat in rooms where the significant conversations happened. But he had colleagues who did. He had the easy familiarity of someone whose name badge opened doors that were invisible to outsiders. And more importantly, he had a mother who was now treating Roya like a daughter she had been waiting for without knowing it. Roya reported the development factually to her handler through a dead drop channel in the city. She described Dariush, his position, his proximity to the relevant network. She did not include the part about how he looked at her. She filed that under the category of things that were not operationally relevant. She was not yet fully honest with herself about whether that categorization was accurate. The access came gradually, the way real access always does. Not through a single door, but through the slow accumulation of presence. Miriam took Roya to a wedding. The wedding was the marriage of the daughter of a family whose name Roya recognized from a briefing she had read in Tel Aviv, in a different room, in a different life. She stood in a garden in Isfahan wearing clothes she had bought at a market she had learned to navigate, surrounded by people who believed entirely that she was who she said she was, and she felt for the first time the particular vertigo of a cover that is working. Working covers feel, from the inside, like a kind of low-level guilt. Not the guilt of having done something wrong, the guilt of knowing something the people around you don't know. It sits in the chest. It is always there. Experienced operatives learn to treat it as background noise, like the sound of a city you have lived in long enough to stop hearing. Roya was not yet experienced. She was still hearing everything. She listened, over months, over dinners, over the kind of conversations that happen when people decide they trust you. She began to build a picture that no satellite had been able to construct. Not of the facilities, she never got near the facilities, but of the human ecosystem surrounding them. Who was frightened? Who was proud? Who had stopped sleeping? Who had a child studying abroad and was quietly, terribly grateful for the distance? She passed what she gathered in fragments through channels she never fully understood the mechanics of to people she had never met. She did not know what was being done with what she gave. She was not told. This was standard. Need to know. She told herself it was fine. The telling herself it was fine was itself a small, early fracture. Dariush asked her to dinner. Not a family dinner, a dinner, the two of them, at a restaurant near the river. She went. The instruction she had been given was use what's there. She used it. She told herself that was all she was doing. What happened over the following 8 months was not in any training manual, not because it was unprecedented. Honey trap operations, relationship-based intelligence access, emotional cover, these are documented, discussed, practiced. What was not in the manual was the specific problem of a cover that requires emotional authenticity colliding with an emotional reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. She was not in love with him. She was clear about that, privately, with herself. But she had been living as Roya for almost 2 years. She had Roya's memories, Roya's grief, Roya's loneliness, and Roya, if Roya had been a real person, would have found Dariush patient, careful, quietly kind, difficult not to respond to. The cover and the person had begun to share a nervous system. She reported this to her handler. Not in those terms, she did not use the word nervous system. She used the language of operational assessment. She wrote that the emotional texture of the access relationship had become complex, and that she was requesting guidance on parameters. The response took 9 days. It said, maintain access, reassess in 90 days. It did not address the complexity, it addressed the access. She understood then something important about her position in this operation. She was not being protected, she was being managed. In the spring of 2008, Dariush's aunt came to visit. Her name was Farideh. She had grown up in Isfahan, had never left Isfahan, and had the particular quality of someone who knows a city the way you only know a place you have never needed to escape from. She knew every family, every neighborhood, every street, and how they had changed. At dinner, Roya mentioned a street name from her fabricated childhood. She had memorized it from a detailed city map, cross-referenced with historical records. It was a good detail, specific, intimate, the kind of thing a person from Isfahan would say. Farideh looked at her with a small, still smile and said that the street had been renamed after the revolution. Before 1979, it had been called something else. She said it gently, the way you correct someone you are not trying to humiliate. Roya agreed immediately. She said she only knew what her mother had told her, and her mother had always been imprecise about names. She laughed, the right kind of laugh, self-deprecating, inviting correction rather than deflecting it. Farideh laughed too. The conversation moved on, but it did not move on, not really. Roya could feel, with the specific sensitivity you develop when your life depends on reading rooms, that Farideh had filed the moment. Not acted on it, not reported it, filed it. With the quiet, unhurried patience of someone who is not in a hurry because she has nowhere to be except here, in this city, watching. She said nothing to her handler about Farideh. She told herself the moment had passed cleanly. She was not fully honest with herself about why she did not report it, and that dishonesty with her own handler was the second fracture, smaller than the first, more significant. There is something that was not known to Roya at the time, something that would not become visible to her until years later, reconstructed from fragments she was not supposed to have access to. In late 2008, a report circulated inside Iranian counterintelligence, a flagged anomaly in the social network surrounding certain Natanz-connected families in Isfahan. The report did not name Roya. It did not describe her. It described instead a male academic, a visiting lecturer from a European university with connections to Iranian expatriate communities, who had been socializing with families in exactly the network Roya had penetrated. The male academic was not Mossad. He was exactly what he appeared to be: a lecturer, curious, sociable, politically engaged in the way that certain Western academics are when they discover that Iran is more complicated than their government's briefings suggest. He was innocent. He was also, from a counterintelligence perspective, a far more visible and suspicious presence than a quiet, grieving woman from Isfahan who had been absorbed into a family. The Iranian counterintelligence apparatus moved toward him. They watched him for 11 months. They eventually asked him to leave the country. They filed him as a probable low-level intelligence contact. Insufficient evidence for arrest, case closed. During those 11 months, the scrutiny that might have turned toward Roya turned away. The window of her greatest exposure risk, the period immediately following Faraday's dinner, when a more focused investigation might have found the seams in her cover, was the same period when Iranian intelligence was fully occupied with someone else. This is the thing about deception that the training manuals cannot account for. Sometimes the cover holds not because it is good, but because the room is looking somewhere else. Sometimes the thing that saves you is not your own skill. It is someone else's mistake, or someone else's luck. Or, and this is the possibility that Roya would sit with for years, in a different country, in a different name, someone else's deliberate choice to look away. The aunt had filed her observation in 2008. The Iranian counterintelligence report had redirected attention in 2008. These two things happened at the same time. Whether that was coincidence, or whether Farideh's observation had been quietly fed somewhere and quietly redirected by someone with an interest in keeping Roya operational and in place, that question has no clean answer. What it means, if the second possibility is true, is that Roya was protected. Not by her handler, not by Tel Aviv, by an unknown party inside the Iranian system who, for reasons she cannot know, decided that a Mossad operative in place was more valuable than an arrested one. Which means she was not just running a deception, she was inside one, and she did not know it. And the operation that her handlers believed they were controlling was, from at least one angle, being permitted, managed, perhaps even shaped, by the people she had been sent to penetrate. The cover was working, for reasons no one on her side fully understood. The proposal came on a Wednesday evening in the early spring of 2009. Darius did not make a production of it. That was consistent with who he was, a man who expressed the most significant things quietly, as though loudness might frighten them away. He said that he had been thinking about the future. He said he wanted her to be in it. He said it, looking at the table, then at her, then at his hands. Roya said she needed time to think. He nodded. He said, of course. He did not ask why a woman who had been in a relationship for 8 months needed time to think about a future with a man she had given every visible indication of caring about. He was too careful to ask that, or too afraid of the answer. Either way, the question he did not ask sat in the room between them for the rest of the evening, large and quiet and patient. She walked home alone. The city was doing what Isfahan does in spring, filling with a particular warmth that comes off the stone of old buildings as they release months of stored cold. She walked slowly. She was running calculations, the way she had been trained to run them. A marriage registration would require documentation she did not fully have, background verification, family contacts who could be called, a government file that would cross-reference her identity against records that, if examined carefully enough by the right person, would not hold. The cover had been designed for a single woman living quietly in the city. It had not been designed for this. This was not a flaw in the operation's planning. It was a flaw in the operation's assumptions. The planners in Tel Aviv had assumed that deep social access would remain social. They had not fully accounted for the possibility that deep social access, sustained over 2 years by a human being rather than a recording device, would produce human consequences. She sent an emergency communication to her handler that night. She laid out the situation in precise operational language. She listed the documentation risks. She listed the verification exposure points. She listed, at the end, without editorializing, that declining the proposal without operational cover for the refusal would produce social damage that could compromise her existing access. Then she sent it and waited. The response took 11 days. 11 days during which Darius told his mother. Mariam cried, quietly, happily, in the way of women who have been waiting for something good for a long time. She called Roya that afternoon and spoke for 40 minutes. She used the word daughter. She asked about the wedding date with the barely contained excitement of someone who had already begun planning. She mentioned relatives who would need to be invited. She mentioned that Farideh would want to be there, and the sound of Farideh's name did something cold to the inside of Roya's chest that she did not allow to show in her voice. She said yes to everything Mariam suggested. She said yes because no was not available. She said yes, and updated her mental ledger with a new column of things that would eventually need to be contradicted, delayed, or abandoned. The ledger was getting heavy. When the response from Tel Aviv finally arrived, it contained no acknowledgement of the 11 days. It contained new documentation, a deeper layer of identity records, supporting materials that would allow a marriage registration to proceed far enough to satisfy initial inquiries without fully completing. And it contained an instruction that was framed as operational guidance but was, in its plain meaning, something harder than that. It said, proceed, maintain the engagement, use the access the relationship creates, reassess after 6 months. She read it twice. Then she understood something she had been slowly approaching for months without allowing herself to arrive at it. The operation was not managing her situation. The operation was using her situation. There was a difference. She had known, intellectually, that difference existed. She now knew it the way you know something when it is happening to you rather than to a concept. She told Dariush yes 2 days later. He smiled in the way of someone who has been trying not to hope and failed. She smiled back, and the smile was real, and the realness of it was the thing that frightened her most. She began accessing what the engagement now opened. The family gatherings expanded. Dariush's colleagues appeared at dinners, men who worked adjacent to the program, who spoke with the particular coded looseness of people who cannot talk about their work, but cannot entirely not talk about it either. She listened with the practiced inattention of someone who appears to be thinking about something else. She filed. She passed. The intelligence she was generating in this period was, according to fragments that have since surfaced in declassified Israeli academic discussions of human intelligence methodology, described as operationally significant. She did not know what operationally significant meant in practice. She knew it meant the engagement, the lie she was living inside, was being extended because it was producing something useful. She had become, in the coldest accounting, too valuable to extract. In the autumn of 2009, she made a mistake. Not a catastrophic one. A small one. The kind that only matters if someone is already watching. At a dinner hosted by a colleague of Dariush's, a man whose name appeared 3 times in briefing materials she had read in Tel Aviv, she mentioned having visited the Friday market as a child. She described a specific stall, a specific smell, a specific quality of light in the afternoon. It was a good memory. She had constructed it carefully from photographs and descriptions. It was exactly the kind of detail that makes a cover feel inhabited. Afterward, on the drive home, Dariush mentioned that the Friday market had been relocated in the 1990s. The stall she described would have been in a different part of the city before that. He said it without accusation, casually, the way you correct a factual error in a story someone you love is telling. He was not suspicious. He was just someone who knew his city. She laughed and said her memory was obviously as unreliable as her mother's. He laughed too. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence. She did not feel comfortable. She felt the specific sensation of a small crack appearing in something that had, until that moment, felt solid. The cover had not broken, but she had heard it. She had heard the sound it made when it was tested, and she understood that she had been making these small errors more frequently, that the mental ledger was becoming too full to maintain with complete precision. that the human being living the cover was beginning to make the kinds of mistakes that human beings make when they are tired. She did not report the incident to her handler. This was the third fracture. The first had been failing to report Faride. The second had been the private realization that she was being managed rather than protected. The third was the beginning of a pattern, a selective editing of what she passed upward. Not lying to her handler, not yet. But choosing, with increasing frequency, what Tel Aviv needed to know and what she would manage herself. The distinction between those two things was narrowing. She did not fully acknowledge that it was narrowing. That was the misjudgment, the assumption that she could carry the weight of what she was not reporting without it accumulating into something structural. Experienced operatives know that the information you withhold from your own side becomes, over time, the most dangerous information in the operation. It has no handler, it has no protocol. It sits inside one person and grows. In December 2009, something happened that temporarily resolved the tension she had been carrying. Dariush was assigned to a project that required him to work extended hours, 6 days a week, for 3 months. The engagement continued on paper. The pressure of its daily maintenance eased. The wedding planning slowed in the natural way that it slows when the man is overwhelmed with work and the woman is managing his mother's expectations. Mariam was frustrated. Roya expressed sympathetic frustration in return. For those 3 months, the operation reached something close to equilibrium. The access remained. The risks were stable. The fractured places in her cover were not being tested. She even slept better. She made the mistake of interpreting the quiet as safety, of treating the pause and pressure as the evidence that the pressure had passed. She reported to her handler that the situation was stable and manageable. She believed it when she wrote it. Faride came back to Isfahan in February. She brought photographs. Old ones this time. Not a test, or not obviously a test. A family album passed around at a Sunday gathering, full of Isfahan in the 1970s and early 1980s. People gathered and pointed and remembered out loud. Faraday placed the album in Roya's hands. She watched her look through it with the particular quality of attention that is not warm and is not hostile and is not anything you could point to as suspicious. It is just very, very present. Roya turned the pages carefully. She said the right things. She asked the right questions. She performed, flawlessly, the role of a woman recognizing a city that shaped her. Faraday thanked her for looking so carefully. She said that most young people flip through old photographs too quickly. She said it with a smile that could mean anything. Roya handed the album back and smiled, and meant nothing at all. The first consequence arrived before the extraction order did. In the winter of 2011, Dariush stopped asking about the wedding date with patience. He started asking with something else underneath it. Not anger, not suspicion, but a kind of worn-down sadness that is in some ways harder to manage than either. He said one evening that he had waited 3 years, that he had told his colleagues, his friends, his family, that Mariam asked him every week and he no longer had an answer that felt true. He was not wrong. He had waited 3 years. He had done everything a man is supposed to do. And the woman across from him had given him every reason to believe she was present while ensuring, through a discipline so practiced it had become involuntary, that she was never fully there. She gave him the answer she had prepared for this moment, a story about wanting to do things properly, about not wanting to rush something important, about the grief of not having family present who remembered her parents. It was a good answer. It was the right answer. It landed the way prepared answers always land, accurately and without warmth. He looked at her afterward with an expression she had not seen on him before. He did not argue. He nodded. He let it go. She understood that night that letting it go was not the same as believing it. He had filed the answer the way Faraday filed things, quietly, without visible consequence, with an interior patience that was its own kind of surveillance. The third fracture, the habit of selective reporting to her handler, had, by this point, widened into something she could no longer describe as selective. She was managing the operation from the inside, making judgment calls that belonged to a station chief, not a field operative, deciding what Tel Aviv needed to know, and shaping those decisions around an outcome she had not been authorized to pursue, staying stable long enough to avoid the extraction she could feel coming. She had begun, without naming it to herself, to protect the cover from her own side. The extraction order came in the spring of 2012. A date, a route, a protocol she had memorized 8 years earlier in a room she was not allowed to discuss. 4 days' notice. Standard, clean, indifferent to everything that had accumulated in the intervening years. She read it and felt nothing identifiable. Later, she would understand that the nothing was the thing itself, that she had been managing her own interior for so long that she had lost reliable access to it. She told Darius she was going to Tehran for a medical appointment. She would be back in a week. She said it in the morning, over tea, with the ordinary ease of a woman who has nothing to hide. He said, "Fine, take care of yourself." He did not look up from what he was reading. She noticed that. She noticed it and filed it in the ledger she would never update again. She packed one bag, the same bag she had arrived with. She left her books on the shelf. She left a half-finished letter on her desk addressed to no one. She left the kettle, the prayer rug she had bought at the Friday market, the photographs she had accumulated over 6 years that contained, somewhere in their edges, the visual record of a life she had not been authorized to live. She did not say goodbye to Miriam. Protocol. A goodbye creates a memory. A memory creates a shape. A shape can be followed. She walked out of the building at 7 in the morning and did not look up at the window where Miriam sometimes stood watching the street. Whether Miriam was standing there, she does not know. She made herself not know. The intelligence she had gathered over 6 years was, by the accounting of those who used it, significant. It had mapped the human architecture of a program that external surveillance could only see from the outside. It had identified vulnerabilities, not in centrifuges or enrichment cascades, but in people, in who was afraid, in who had a child studying in Europe they were desperate to protect, in who had begun asking, privately, whether the thing they were building was worth what it was costing them. What was done with that mapping, she learned in fragments, from news reports, from things her debriefers let slip, from the particular silences that fell when she asked certain questions. Operations she was never briefed on had used the human architecture she had spent 6 years constructing. Scientists had been approached. Some had cooperated. Some had vanished in ways that were not accounted for by natural causes. She does not know precisely which outcomes her intelligence produced. She was not told this is standard. It is also, in the way of things that are technically standard but humanly unbearable, a cruelty. She knows that Darius's colleagues, men she had sat across from at dinner tables, men whose children's names she knew, men who had trusted her with the ordinary, unguarded conversation of someone who believes they are among friends, had been in some cases targeted using information that passed through her hands. She cannot calculate the precise line between what she gathered and what was done with it. That uncertainty is permanent. It is the kind of uncertainty that clinical literature on deep cover operatives describes, carefully and without drama, as one of the most difficult, long-term psychological consequences of the work. Not guilt exactly, something more structural than guilt, a permanent inability to locate yourself in the moral accounting of what happened. The Iranian government's counterintelligence report, the one that surfaced years later, noted in a single line that an unidentified female operative had been present in Isfahan between 2006 and 2012 and had been successfully identified after departure. What the report did not note, but what its timeline implies, is that the identification was not entirely posthumous. The watching had begun earlier. The decision not to move on it had been made by someone, for reasons the report does not illuminate. Farideh's name appears nowhere in any available record. Whether she reported her observations through an informal channel, whether she was connected to counterintelligence in any capacity, whether her patience was personal or professional, these are questions without public answers. What the timeline suggests is that the protection Roya received in 2008, when Iranian counterintelligence redirected toward the innocent European academic, came from somewhere with access to the right rooms at the right moment. The operation that Mossad believed it was running had been, from at least one angle, allowed to run. The intelligence Roya gathered had been, in some portion, permitted to leave. What Iran gained from permitting it, whether they fed disinformation through the social channels Roya was monitoring, whether they used the Mossad network's behavior to map Israeli intelligence priorities, whether there was simply a calculation that a known penetration is manageable and an unknown one is not, is the question that her debriefers asked repeatedly and could not resolve. The cover had worked. The reasons it worked remain, in part, the property of the people she had been sent to deceive. She was debriefed for 3 weeks in a facility outside Tel Aviv. She was evaluated. She was offered a desk position. She declined. She was offered a period of leave. She accepted it and did not return at the end of it. Eventually, the leave became something else, and then it became permanent, and her file was closed with the bureaucratic neutrality of an institution that has extracted what it needed. The clinical literature on deep cover operatives, the small body of it that exists in unclassified form, describes a phenomenon called identity residue, not a disorder, not a breakdown, a kind of permanent cognitive texture left by years of inhabiting a false self. The habits do not fully leave. The reflex of managing your presentation before you experience it. The tendency to calculate an answer before feeling it. The way a simple question about your past. Where did you grow up? What was your mother like? What is your earliest memory? Produces a half-second pause that has nothing to do with the difficulty of remembering, and everything to do with the difficulty of knowing which answer is true. She is, by all accounts, functional. She lives somewhere that is not Tel Aviv and not Isfahan. She has a name that is neither of the names she has used in this story. She does not discuss the work. She does not give interviews. The details of her operation have surfaced only in the fractured, partial way that classified operations surface, through reports that name the shape of something without naming the thing itself, through debriefers who remember more than they say, through the specific texture of an absence in the record where a person used to be. Mariam waited. Dariush waited. After 4 months, a missing persons report was filed and quietly closed. The apartment was eventually rented to someone else. The books on the shelf, the kettle, the photographs, whatever became of them is not recorded anywhere. There is a question that deep cover operations leave permanently open, not whether the intelligence was worth the cost. Institutions answer that question in one direction, always. The question that does not get answered is simpler and harder. What do you do with a person who was real, who was not a cover, who was not a legend, who was built over 6 years by the accumulation of ordinary human trust when the operation is over? What do you do with Roya, who never existed and who cannot be fully left behind? The answer that intelligence agencies give in practice is you close the file, you move on, you begin building the next one. The answer that the person carrying her has to live with is different and longer, and does not have an extraction protocol. If the architecture of deception interests you, how identities are built, how they fail, and what they cost the people inside them, the next operation goes deeper. Stay with Hidden Ops.